Here's the question. How do we get from Newton's theism to Hawking's atheism? I want to argue that we get to it by three false steps. Firstly, false logic. Secondly, false ideas about the nature of God. And thirdly, false ideas about the nature of scientific explanation. So I know it is late at night, and logic is not the most popular topic to lecture on late at night, but I'm going to take the risk, if you don't mind. Let's analyze this central statement. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Because there is a law of gravity, that is because there is something. The universe can and will create itself from nothing. Flat contradiction, number one. Because there is gravity, no, he doesn't say that, because there is a law of gravity. But what would a law of gravity mean if there's no gravity? Law of gravity means that you've got a mathematical description describing something that exists. And laws don't create things. That's a mistake that is frequently made. I once asked the chemist in Oxford, Professor Peter Atkins, what created the universe? And he said mathematics. And I'm afraid I'd never met Peter before, so I started to laugh, which was very rude. And he said, why are you laughing? Well, I said, I'm really sorry, Peter, but that must be the most absurd thing I've ever heard, because I am a mathematician. And he said, what's wrong with that? I said, 1 + 1 = 2. Yes, he said. Did that ever put £2 in your pocket? Incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, if you want a brief economic analysis of the financial crisis, it's very simple. It's because a lot of clever people thought that you could use mathematics to create money. It's called creative accounting. You've heard of it. So there's a second mistake. There's a third as well. The universe can and will create itself from nothing. Well, if we say X creates Y, roughly speaking, if you've got X, you'll get Y. If we say X creates X, if you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? Well, it means that nonsense remains nonsense even if scientists write it. This has 3 levels of unintelligibility and incoherence and false logic. And it's the central argument of one of the brightest scientists today. You say, that's tough stuff. Yes, it is tough stuff, ladies and gentlemen. But it's what provoked my earlier remark. Scientists' statements are not necessarily statements of science. This isn't a statement of science. It isn't a statement even of rationally intelligible language. And if that's what's needed to get rid of God, it's not too impressive, is it? It bears out what Einstein said, the physicist is a poor philosopher. Now, I'm very well aware that some philosophers are very poor physicists as well, so we need to be careful. But this kind of thing disturbs me greatly, because it's not a scientific statement, it's not an intelligible statement, and yet it's given as a major reason for getting rid of God. Now, of course, the word nothing's in there. And you know, as I get older, I get so interested in nothing. In fact, I give lectures on nothing these days. And you'd be amazed how many people come to listen to them. What would you make of this? This is a statement by one of the world's most famous astrophysicists, a militant atheist, whom I have debated. He's written a book called A Universe from Nothing, and this appears early on in the book. Surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. What? If a 12-year-old wrote that, this is serious, I'm afraid. This is the stuff that's being put across into the public space to convince people that there's no intelligence behind the universe. Well, I must say I am massively unimpressed. That's the start. That's the logic. Now the second bit is false ideas about God. You've probably all seen this cartoon. Mathematics on the left, mathematics on the right, and in the middle, then a miracle occurs. And one scientist said Says the other, you might be a bit more explicit in step 2 here. The idea that there are great gaps and science is meant to fill them. And the idea has come around, and people like Hawking believe it, and so does Dawkins. They think that I believe in a God who's like one of the Greek gods, like the god of lightning depicted there. That is a god of the gaps. Now, what does that mean? It means, crudely put, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now, of course, you can see that the ancient Greeks didn't understand lightning. They were afraid of it. They postulated a god behind it. And just 1 or 2 lessons in atmospheric physics at Queen's that god will disappear. Gods of the gaps disappear, and rightly so, by the advance of science. The Greek gods have been decimated because the cosmic chemistry of the Greek gods doesn't stand up to science. But then the God of the biblical revelation is not like the Greek gods. Now, this is vastly important to understand if you're going to get into the contemporary debate. Because many contemporary intellectuals will just list the gods like Zeus and Artemis and so on, and then say, we're atheists with respect to all of them, and so are you. And I am, you know. I'm an Zeusist, totally convinced. And an Artemist, and an Aphroditist, and all the rest of it. I'm a complete atheist with respect to those gods. And then they grin and say to you, we just go one God further. And we get rid of Jehovah. But just a minute. That shows they haven't a clue. And they've studied nothing about the nature of the ancient Greek gods. Now, why do I say that? Because those who have studied them, and I'm one of them, because I'm very interested in ancient gods and ancient worldviews, have come to the conclusion that the gods of the ancient Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans had one thing in common. They all were produced by the primeval matter of the universe. They are descended, as Werner Jaeger, one of the great experts on the topic, they are descended from the heaven and the earth. And in his magisterial book, he says, the God of the Bible created the heavens and the earth. There is a vast difference. Now, you see, if you define God to be the explanation for what science has not yet explained, a God of the gaps, then of course you have to choose between science and God, because that's the way you've defined God. And that, when I noticed it some years ago, totally illuminated me why Stephen Hawking says to students around the world and professors, you must choose between science and God. It's because he's thinking of a God in the gaps. And of course you have to choose. But you see, the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. He's God of the whole show. The bits you do understand, the bits you don't. Incidentally, I hope some of you have read at least to page 1 of the Bible. It's really very interesting. Indeed, I hope you've read the first sentence. In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. Is that what your text says? Of course not. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's grammatically, it's a merism. It covers everything from one end to the other, heavens and earth, the whole show. The bits we understand and the bits we don't. And actually, it was Newton's faith, Clerk Maxwell's faith, and my faith that has been stimulated not by what we don't understand, but by what we do. And that's the way your mind works, isn't it? The more you understand of art, the more you admire a Rembrandt, not the less. The more you understand engineering, the more you can admire a turbofan jet, not the less. And so the more we understand of how the universe works, the more we can admire the genius of the God that did it that way. So false logic's the first problem. A false concept of God is the second. And then the third is the false ideas about the nature of scientific explanation. What do we mean by an explanation? And it's very common for people to be faced with some sort of problem in science, and they're told, we have an explanation in terms of a law. And the impression given is that's it. That's all there is to be known about it. I used to think that about gravity, you see, because I'm afraid I was taught when I was quite young that the law of gravity explained gravity. That is a profound mistake. The law of gravity, the one thing it does not explain is gravity. In fact, nobody knows what gravity is, even today. But you see, I wasn't encouraged to read Newton in those days, but I've read him since. And Newton says explicitly that he doesn't even try to explain what gravity is. I have not been able to discover the cause of these properties of gravity from phenomena, and I frame no hypotheses. Hypotheses non fingo, a very famous statement of Newton's. I have no explanation, that is, as to what the cause of this ultimately is. Now, isn't that interesting? The law of gravity, which is brilliant mathematical formulation, it enables us to do superb calculations. It does not tell us what gravity is. So even within science itself, these laws are partial. Almost all of them are. They only give us an explanation of a certain aspect of the reality. And it was Wittgenstein, a philosopher, who's not always easy to understand, who put it something like this: the great delusion of modernity is that the laws of nature explain the universe for us. The laws of nature describe the universe, they describe the regularities, but they explain nothing. That orientates our perspective. So we move on to levels of explanation. Why is the water boiling? Is a good question to ask. It's boiling because the heat energy from the gas flame is being conducted through the copper kettle base. You see, we're in Ireland. And that's agitating the molecules of water. They're moving faster and faster. That's why it's boiling. Nonsense. It's boiling because I would very much like a cup of tea. Now, why are you laughing? Because you see, I'm talking nonsense. But just think then of what you've just heard. I have given you two different explanations of the same phenomenon. One in terms of scientific law and mechanism, if you like, the other in terms of personal agency. And what I want you to notice is, firstly, in order to understand the phenomenon comprehensively, both of those explanations are necessary. Do they conflict or compete? Of course not. And interestingly enough, people have been drinking and enjoying tea for thousands of years before they knew anything about heat equations. Why cannot people see this about the universe? You see, the profound mistake that Dawkins encourages us to make is a complete Aunt Sally, and it's this: the God explanation is the same as the science explanation, and so they compete. That's sheer nonsense. Let me put it very simply for you. Newton's law of gravitation no more competes with God as an explanation of the universe than the law of internal combustion competes with Henry Ford as an explanation for a motor car engine. They're different kinds of explanation. They don't compete, they don't conflict, they complement, and both are necessary. And illustrations like that show the paucity and the limit of imagination for people to think that the only valid explanation is a scientific one, scientism. It's sheer nonsense in most cases. Now, of course, we need to come back to the question as to whether true explanation is always reductionist. And Richard Dawkins will hit you with this. He'll either say to you, if you believe God's the creator, that doesn't make any sense, because God is more complex than the creation, and you'll have to ask who created God and who created the God and so on, so we can forget that. The alternative version of that question is using God as an explanation is absurd, since God is by definition more complex than the thing you are explaining. That sounds very impressive, until you apply it to Dawkins' own book in which it stands. I pick up this book called The God Delusion, in which this sentence stands. And I search around. I think it might be interesting to ask what is the origin of this book, since it's quite complicated. It's about 400 pages. And somebody comes along, some bright spark, and says, you know, this book originates in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. And I said, don't be ridiculous. Your explanation is far more complicated than the thing you're explaining. But what do you do with that? It's exactly the same argument. And it's a nonsensical argument. But I want you to see why it is. How is it you know there's a mind behind that statement? Because you know there's a mind behind that dinner menu which you enjoyed this evening, in case you've forgotten. Now, how do you know that? There are only a dozen words up there. But they're in a language you understand and learned independently. And you know immediately that even though many automatic processes may have been involved in printing that menu, there's a mind behind it. The explanation for the menu is very much more complex than the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. Now, this is greatly important. We live in the information age. And all these attempts that have been made over the centuries to reduce the whole universe to atoms in the void fails utterly when it comes to anything that involves language and semiotics. Semiotics from the Greek word semeion, which means a sign. And as Roger Sperry said, the meaning of the message will not be found in the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. I love this statement because I have great fun with it, you know. We have nice dinners in our college in Oxford, and we don't choose where we sit. That's sometimes a disadvantage, because on one occasion, and you may have heard me tell this story before, forgive me, but it makes the point very well. I found myself sitting beside one of the world's leading biochemists. And he made the usual Oxford mistake of asking me what I did. So I said, I'm a pure mathematician. Oh, he said, how dreadfully boring. And he meant it. So I thought I'd better get out of this. So I said, well, actually, I'm interested in other things as well, because I'm fellow here in philosophy of science as well. And he said, well, what interests you there? Well, I said, really, I'm interested in the big questions. He said, what big questions? Well, I said, the universe, think of the universe that we study as scientists, you and I. What is its status? He said, what do you mean? I said, is it created or not? Oh, he said, it's far worse than I thought. He said, listen, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we've got nothing to talk to one another about. We're going to have a thoroughly miserable evening. That's quite a challenge at the beginning of dinner, isn't it? So I looked at him and I smiled. I said, on the contrary, I think we're going to have a fascinating evening. He said, are we? I said, sure. I said, think of the concept of reductionism. I know at least 3 kinds. What kind do you? Well, that stumped him for a minute or two. And he said, well, I'm the basic kind. I said, you mean an ontological reductionist, ontos being. You believe that everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. Yes, he said, that's what I believe. I believe that you can reduce things to constituent parts. Yes, I said, that's very interesting. Well, let's come to that in a moment, I said, but, you know, I'm a reductionist. He said, are you? Yes, I'm an epistemological reductionist. And a methodological reductionist. He said, what do you mean by that? Well, I said, when I've got a big problem in mathematics, I split it into little ones, and I try and get insight in the little ones and get some insight in the big one. Well, he said, I do that too. Oh, he said, we have something to talk about then. We have this in common. But he said the other stuff, ontological reductionism. Yes, I said, well, I tell you what, I said, since we're sitting at dinner in Oxford, why don't we do an experiment? He said, what, here at the dinner table? I said, sure, this is Oxford. What do you think? So he said, what's the experiment? So I picked up the menu and showed him roast chicken. He said, what's the problem? I said, from where I sit, none. But from where you sit? He said, what's the problem? It says roast chicken. I said, how do you know? Well, he said, look, it's written there. But I said, how do you know it's roast chicken? Well, he said, I've learnt English. Oh, I said, really? Now, I said, you're a reductionist. Yes. Everything reduced to physics and chemistry? Yes. Okay, I said, explain to me how those marks on the paper, R-O-A-S-T, bear the meaning roast chicken, but you're only allowed to use the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. Silence. And then his wife said, "Get out of that if you can." He didn't try. His reply was stunningly honest. And in a very friendly voice, he said, "John," he said, "you know, for 40 years I've gone into my lab in Oxford thinking that could be done." Talk about honesty. And he said, "It can't be done." And I was so surprised. I played devil's advocate, and I said, "But physics and chemistry have only been going for a few hundred years." He said, "It doesn't matter. You cannot explain the meaning in terms of physics and chemistry." And then he looked at me, and I could see what he was thinking. "You're not bright enough to have thought of that argument. Where did you get it?" So I said, "I got this argument from a Nobel Prize winner." Oh, he said, "What a relief." But I wasn't finished, because he had told me he studied the longest word we've ever seen, the human genetic code. So I said, "What about that then? That's not 4 or 5 letters long. And you postulated mind behind 4 or 5 letters. That's 3.5 billion letters long, all in the right order. What about that?" "Chance and necessity," he said. I said, "Really?" "Chance and the laws of nature, yes." "Well," I said, "why then don't you attribute something infinitely simpler to chance and necessity?" It's an interesting question, isn't it? In each of the 10 trillion cells of our bodies, there's the longest word we've ever seen. And the wisdom of the world at the moment is to ascribe it to chance and necessity without the remotest evidence that chance and necessity can prove it. Listen carefully, I'm not talking about evolution. I'm talking about the origin of life itself. So, we reach a very interesting situation. And it is very interesting that we have an information-bearing macromolecule. And Anthony Flew, who was the great Dawkins of his day, came to believe in a God of some kind as a result of the complexity and its nature of DNA. Now, I'm going to finish by just moving on a little bit and using that, but stepping back from it for a moment. You see, we do our science by thinking. And there have been some geniuses in doing their thinking. And Einstein was, of course, one of the best. And Einstein was honest enough to say that at the heart of science there was faith. Not faith in God, but faith in the intelligibility of the universe. And he said, "I cannot conceive of a genuine scientist without that profound faith." And it raises a very big question. If there is no God behind the universe, if it's only atoms and empty space, why should we trust the workings of our own mind? My teacher of quantum mechanics at Cambridge, John Polkinghorne, "Physics is powerless to explain its fundamental belief in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe for the simple reason that we can do no physics without believing it." And so here's another thing that I discuss with my colleagues. I sometimes go into the common room and say to someone, "What do you do science with?" And they always love to tell me about the latest $1 million computer or something. And I said, no, I mean, "Oh, you mean mind?" And they're about to say mind when they remember there's no such thing as the mind these days. There's only the brain. So I do it with my brain. I say, "Okay, I believe actually that the mind and the brain are to be distinguished. There's a mind story, there's a brain story, but I'll accept it for the moment. You're telling me you do science with your brain." "Exactly." I said, "Tell me about the brain. Give me the short account of the brain as you see it." And so often they say something like, "Well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process." And I look at them with a great smile and I say, "And do you trust it?" I said, "Tell me honestly, if you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? I've never had anybody say yes. So I said, you have a problem, haven't you? And sometimes they're very perceptive. They say, where did you get that argument from? And I say, I'm going to surprise you where I got it. Here's where I got it. Charles Darwin. What? Yes. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed, so he believed, from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to cut a very long story short, this has become a central argument in the debate. On what basis can we trust the human mind even to do science? Here's Plantinga on it. If Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own atheism. Now, Plantinga is a distinguished Christian philosopher, but this next person is a distinguished atheist philosopher at the very top level. And he wrote a book a couple of years ago which shook cyberspace and shook the Dawkins of this world into a state almost of apoplexy, as you'll see if you look it up at the internet. Mind and Cosmos, wrote Thomas Nagel, why the neo-Darwinian view of the world is almost certainly false. I've never read a subtitle as explosive as that in my life, written by a brilliant atheist. And his argument is this, and it has to do with all we've been saying. If the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. And C.S. Lewis, years ago, he saw the problem, and it's now become really important. And I find people discussing it now all around the world. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. If ultimate reality is not material, not to take this into account in our context is to neglect the most important fact of all. Yet the supernatural dimension has not only been forgotten, it has been ruled out of court by many. The naturalists have been engaged in thinking about nature. They have not attended to the fact that they were thinking. The moment one attends to this, it is obvious that one's own thinking cannot be merely a natural event and something other than nature exists. Do you realize what that's saying? It's saying your capacity to think and reason is an evidence of supernature. You don't even have to go to the miracles of the New Testament, although they're immensely important for me as a Christian. Supernature breaks in the moment you think a thought. And Lewis has got it exactly right. You see, we've been looking this evening, ladies and gentlemen, at two worldviews. The worldview of theism, Christian theism in my case, and the worldview of naturalism, an atheistic worldview. The atheistic worldview starts with atoms and empty space. And therefore everything else, including life, consciousness, the human mind, is derivative. The biblical worldview is the exact opposite of that. And it says, in the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. That is word, information. Mind is primary, and the physical universe is derivative. Those two worldviews clash. They're absolutely incompatible. And so I answer my question, do science and God mix? Well, my argument is that they mix very well. But science and atheism do not mix, because atheism logically leads to doubt about the validity of the rational processes needed to do science or any reasoning whatsoever. Thank you very much.